12 sleepless hours later, the next morning, many frame building attempts later, even more boat building attempts later, one day later, one humongous meal later, a little while later that night, one entree later, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, several bouquets later, 10 hours later, 80 minutes later, many memories later, 1 week later, happy friendiversary. Later, many unbearable moments later. The next morning, many adorable hours later. Several days later, much later. 1 week later. One beautiful Christmas morning later. Many versions later. 1 week later. Many meeps later. Many plays later. Many superstitions later. 2,000-ish years later.
Many buckets later!
14 hours later. Days later. Meanwhile, many repressed memories later. The next morning, 1 nap later. 24 sleepless hours later. Several days later. 1 journey through space later. Much tranquility later. Many invitations later. 6 to 8 weeks later. 2 weeks later. 1 hour later. Many hours later. A few moments later. 800 kajillion potatoes later. Several hard-hitting hours later. The next day.
1 minute and 7 seconds earlier!
A while later. Many miles later. The next day. 1 week later. 1 bus ride later. The next morning. Many exam questions later. The next morning. Many hours later. 2 minutes later. Several hours later. Several thousand ripped pants later. 1 hour later. Several months later. 200 whoopsies later. 6 stinky months later. Several weeks later. Later that night.